Two experienced hikers vanish in the scorching heart of Death Valley. Henkel and Alex Lofgren thought they were prepared for anything, yet a simple weekend getaway spiraled into a tragic fight for survival. One of them would not make it out alive. This is a true survival story of adventure turned nightmare and the extraordinary resilience that emerged from it. But how did everything go so terribly wrong, and how did one of them manage to defy Death Valley's deadly odds? Emily and Alex set out on April 3, 2021, eager to unplug from the world. Both were seasoned outdoor enthusiasts in their early 30s, confident, capable, and craving adventure. Alex, an Army veteran and congressional aide, had a reputation for venturing into isolated wilds. Emily, his girlfriend, often joined him on these excursions, sharing in the beauty and challenges of nature. They departed Helendale, California that morning with plans for a carefree camping trip in Death Valley National Park. Their SUV, a sturdy Subaru Forester, was loaded with water, camping gear, and food supplies. The plan was loose: explore some famous sites during the day, then find a quiet spot under the stars to camp at night. No set itinerary, no reserved campsite, just freedom and the open desert ahead of them. It felt like the perfect escape. As they drove deeper into the park, a friendly park ranger suggested a more secluded camping area off the beaten path. Always up for something different, Emily and Alex agreed to check it out. The ranger pointed them toward Gold Valley Road, a rugged backcountry route known only to adventurous souls. The dirt road snaked into one of the most remote parts of Death Valley. Bouncing along the uneven terrain, they were thrilled. This was exactly the kind of off-grid experience they loved. Their Forester handled the ruts and rocks capably at first, and the couple traded excited smiles as the dusty miles passed by. Little did they know, they were venturing far beyond the reach of cell signal, other people, or easy rescue. Death Valley's landscape is deceptively beautiful, yet extremely harsh. The park's vast salt flats, sand dunes, and baking canyons offer little shelter from relentless heat. Death Valley is the lowest point in North America, a desert basin framed by steep, colorful mountains that seem to stretch on forever. In spring, wildflowers can carpet the valley floor, and distant snow might cap the peaks, beauty that masks the brutality of this environment. Temperatures here can soar above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and water is virtually non-existent. As afternoon turned to evening, Emily and Alex marveled at the stark scenery outside their windows. The endless expanse of salt flats, sun-scorched dunes rippling in the distance, and the absolute silence enveloping them. It felt like driving on another planet. They had ventured many places together, but Death Valley's remoteness and scale were on a different level. Still, with a reliable vehicle and plenty of supplies, they felt secure. This desert was awe-inspiring, but they respected its dangers. They had no intention of taking unnecessary risks. As the sun dipped lower, their excitement was abruptly replaced by a surge of panic. Around 5:30 p.m., without warning, two sharp pops echoed under the car. The steering lurched. Emily's stomach dropped as Alex eased the Subaru to a stop on the desolate track. They hopped out to inspect and discovered a nightmare scenario. Both right-side tires were blown out, shredded by a jagged rock partly buried in the road. Alex muttered a curse under his breath. They had only one spare tire. Two flats at once meant they were completely stranded, deep in the backcountry. A quick glance at their phones confirmed there was no cell reception this far out, not a single bar. And by their best guess, they were roughly 22 miles from the nearest paved road. In every direction stretched an empty desert, no shade, no water sources, and now no functioning vehicle. The reality hit hard. They were trapped in one of the most unforgiving places on Earth as nightfall approached. For a moment, they just stood there in shock beside the wounded Subaru, the enormity of the situation sinking in. But Emily and Alex weren't the type to give up or panic. Their survival instincts kicked in quickly. They knew the cardinal rule of desert emergencies: don't wander aimlessly and don't waste daylight. The couple took a deep breath and began thinking through their next move: stay with the car or try to hike out. It was a wrenching choice. The car provided shelter and a bit of safety, but the nearest help was far away. After some deliberation, they decided to spend the night at the vehicle and set out on foot at first light. They would be better prepared to travel in cooler early hours than in darkness or midday heat. That evening, by the fading glow of dusk, They pored over maps and guidebooks, formulating a plan for the following day. Inside the SUV, Emily and Alex methodically assembled a day pack with the essentials. They knew this trek could be life or death, so they packed carefully. Several liters of water, about a 3-day supply between them, a few pouches of tuna for protein and energy, a well-stocked survival kit, other basics like a flashlight, pocket knife, and matches. They dressed in layers for the chilly night and tried to get some rest in the car, but sleep came fitfully. Surrounded by the vast darkness of Death Valley, they felt the weight of isolation. Stars blazed above, beautiful and indifferent. Alex, ever the optimist, squeezed Emily's hand and assured her. They both understood that once the sun rose, the clock would start ticking on the intense desert heat. At 4 a.m., long before dawn, they awoke and readied themselves. In the cool pre-dawn air, they made a critical decision. Instead of trying to walk 22 miles back along the road they drove in, which would be a painfully long slog through unknown terrain, they opted for a shortcut. Their maps showed a more direct route toward civilization, heading toward Mormon Point, an area by the main valley floor through a mountain pass. There was a marked trail in that direction, and if they could reach it and get over the pass, they might find other hikers or at least get closer to frequented areas of the park. It was risky to chart a new course rather than retrace their known path, but it could save precious miles. Time and water were their most limited resources, and this plan offered a glimmer of hope for a quicker escape. Before leaving the car, Emily and Alex took smart precautions. They scribbled a note and left it on the dashboard. 2 flat tires, headed to Mormon Point, have 3 days' worth of water. This way, if rescuers or anyone stumbled upon their abandoned vehicle, they'd know where the couple was headed and that they were on foot. Next, they made the car as conspicuous as possible in case of an aerial search. They hung a reflective survival blanket on the car's antenna and hood so it would glint in the sun, a beacon against the earth tones of the desert. On the ground nearby, they arranged stones into a large arrow, pointing in the direction of their intended route toward Mormon Point. Satisfied that they'd left a clear SOS and trail of breadcrumbs, the pair shouldered their pack. In the blackness of early morning, they set off, guided by headlamps in the faint light of a crescent moon. Hiking under the pre-dawn sky, Emily was struck by the eerie stillness of Death Valley at night. The silence was absolute, broken only by their footsteps crunching over sand and gravel. A faint silver glow lit the desert as the moon hung overhead, casting long shadows behind the couple. Despite the gravity of their situation, there were moments when they couldn't help but appreciate the stark beauty around them. The air was cool, almost pleasant, and overhead, a tapestry of stars slowly yielded to the first hint of daylight. In those moments, Emily allowed herself tiny embers of optimism. They were doing everything right so far. Alex flashed her an encouraging grin whenever their eyes met, silently saying, "We've got this." And Emily would nod back. They had no choice but to believe it. As dawn broke, they navigated through a rocky canyon, following what they hoped was the trail indicated on their map. To their relief, as light grew, they stumbled onto an actual footpath, confirmation they were on the right track toward the pass. A couple of hours in, around 8 a.m., they got their first real flicker of hope. Alex spotted a small metal box tucked under some rocks along the trail. It was a geocache container left by hikers. Inside, they found a logbook and a few trinkets left by previous adventurers. Flipping through the logbook's pages, they saw recent dates and signatures, evidence that other human beings had indeed been in this very spot not long ago. Just knowing others had walked this route buoyed their spirits. Emily and Alex added their names in a quick note about their situation in the logbook in case someone found it later. This little unexpected discovery reassured them. They were not alone in the wilderness after all, and the trail was real. Pocketing a small token for luck, they pressed onward with renewed determination. However, Death Valley was not about to let them off easy. As the morning sun climbed, the terrain grew more challenging. The trail led them into a narrowing gorge, a slot canyon with towering walls of rock on either side. The further they went, the more treacherous it became. They had to scramble over boulders and skirt along ledges as the canyon twisted and turned. The temperature was rising steadily now, and in the confines of those high walls, the air felt still and oven-like. Emily's broken-in hiking boots scuffed on loose stones as she carefully placed each step. Both of them were drenched in sweat. Every gulp from their water bottles was a precious trade-off between staying hydrated and conserving what remained. Still, they moved with purpose, urging each other on. They knew they had to clear the mountains before the full force of midday heat. Not long after finding the geocache, the couple noticed a brief note in its logbook referencing a 70-foot waterfall ahead. At the time, it hadn't fully registered. The word waterfall sounded almost refreshing in that dry land. But roughly a mile later, they understood. The canyon abruptly opened out at the top of a sheer drop. Waterfall, when it rains, was an understatement. What they faced was a vertical cliff about 70 feet high, a dry falls that must occasionally roar with water after rare storms. Now, however, it was just a colossal rock face, completely barren and imposing, blocking their path. Alex and Emily peered over the edge and felt their hearts sink. The trail they needed to follow appeared to continue down at the canyon floor far below, but between them and that floor was a sheer plunge with no obvious safe way down. They stood at the brink of this dry waterfall, realizing the gravity of their predicament. Turning back felt like defeat, retracing miles uphill in growing heat with limited water back to a car that still wouldn't be going anywhere. But going forward looked impossibly dangerous without climbing gear. They had no ropes, no harnesses, nothing to safely descend a 70-foot vertical. Emily's voice trembled as she asked, "What do we do now?" Alex's jaw tightened. He leaned over carefully, scouting for any possible way to climb down using natural footholds or ledges in the rock. There were a few juts and cracks that might be navigable. From where they stood, they could not see the entire route down. Perhaps there was a slope or gentler section out of sight. They spent a few minutes searching along the canyon rim for an alternate way around the falls, but found nothing but more sheer walls. The only other option would be to backtrack for hours and try a different route entirely, losing precious time and energy. Emily and Alex shared a long look. This was a fateful crossroads. With limited options and an urgent need to find help, they made the toughest decision of their lives. They would attempt to climb down the 70-foot drop to continue toward safety. It was a moment filled with dread and determination. Alex squeezed Emily's shoulder. "We'll go slow. We can do this," he assured her, masking his own fear. Emily nodded, her throat dry with anxiety. She trusted Alex's climbing ability more than her own, and he volunteered to go first. The plan was for him to descend part way, then help guide her down from below if possible. They both knew this was extremely risky, but their calculation was that standing still meant certain doom, while attempting the descent at least gave them a fighting chance. Alex removed his backpack and carefully began inching down the rock face, feeling for footholds. Every move counted. One mistake could be fatal. Emily watched from above, hands trembling as she braced herself against a boulder. "One step at a time," she called out softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "No risks, okay? Take it slow, please." Alex managed a quick, tight smile upward. He moved deliberately, testing each hold. Pebbles dislodged and skittered into the abyss with every cautious shift of his weight. For a few minutes, progress was steady, but then he paused. From Emily's vantage, he looked precariously small against the giant cliff. She could see him feeling around with his boot for the next foothold and coming up empty. The rock surface below him was nearly smooth. Alex craned his neck to look back up at her. "I don't see a safe way down from here," he shouted, frustration in his voice. "I'm going to climb back up." Emily exhaled, realizing she'd been holding her breath. Relief and worry mingled inside her. Getting down was proving harder than expected, but at least he was choosing to come back. Maybe they could find another approach or rethink their plan. She watched intently as Alex started to ascend toward her. He had to climb a bit sideways to reach the last solid handhold he'd used. Emily knelt at the edge, ready to extend an arm once he got close enough. Her heart pounded in her chest as she murmured encouragement under her breath. "Come on, you've got this." Suddenly, Alex's right hand slipped on the rock. It happened in an instant. He tried to recover, scrambling for any grip, but the cliff offered nothing but unforgiving, slick stone at that spot. "I lost my grip," he yelled, his voice bursting with panic. For a split second, time froze. Emily's mind went blank with shock. "What do you mean you— Alex, no!" she screamed, reaching out instinctively though he was far beyond reach. Gravity seized him. In the blink of an eye, Alex fell backward into the void. Emily could only watch in horror as the love of her life plunged 70 feet down the face of the dry waterfall. He hit an outcropping with a sickening thud, then tumbled out of sight onto the canyon floor below. "Alex!" Emily's scream echoed off the canyon walls, a sound of pure terror and anguish that dissipated into the vast desert emptiness. Her entire body went cold. She was shaking uncontrollably, her mind refusing to process what she had just witnessed. One moment he was there, climbing toward safety. The next, he was gone. For a few eternal seconds, Emily was paralyzed with fear at the top of that cliff. Then she forced herself to act. Crawling to her stomach, she peered over the edge, looking for any sign of movement below. The drop was so high and the ledges so jagged that she couldn't see where Alex had landed from her angle. Silence. Then, faintly, she heard a sound that made her heart leap, a groan and the weak sound of Alex calling her name. He was alive, terribly hurt, but alive. Adrenaline surged through Emily's veins. "Hold on, I'm coming!" she shouted down into the canyon, hoping he could hear her. Somehow she had to reach him. She knew time was critical. His injuries could be fatal without help, and he was far out of her sight below a ledge. Emily realized that climbing down the way Alex had attempted was impossible for her, especially now in her panicked state. But then she remembered something. Just before the fall, as they were scouting the cliff, she had noticed a narrow crack in the left wall of the canyon. It was essentially a deep chimney-like fissure, too tight to call a proper trail, but maybe tight enough to brace herself and climb down gradually. Alex had gone down the right side where the waterfall was sheer. This cleft on the opposite side looked like it might offer some handholds if one could wedge inside it. It was still an extremely dangerous route, but Emily's decision was already made. There was no way she was going to leave Alex down there alone, and no way she could forgive herself if she didn't at least try to reach him. Her own safety no longer mattered. Limping and scrambling, Emily made her way around the rim to that left side crevice. The opening was just wide enough for her to fit her body into. Steeling herself, she turned around to face the rock and began to descend into the crack, pressing her back against one wall and her feet against the other. It was like a natural ladder, except the rungs were rough rock edges digging into her skin. She wedged her arms and legs outward to slow her descent, inch by agonizing inch. "Don't look down," told herself, focusing only on each foothold. Sharp rocks scraped her elbows and knees through her clothes. About halfway down, her boot slipped on a loose bit of stone, and for one heart-stopping moment, she nearly lost her hold. Emily froze, heart hammering, dust raining around her. She clenched her jaw and continued. With each downward shuffle, her muscles burned and quivered from strain. Roughly 30 feet from the bottom of the canyon, the crack widened and the walls became too far apart for her to brace effectively. She had reached a dead end in this improvised route. There were no more handholds within reach, and she was still suspended high above the ground. Looking between her feet, Emily saw a small, sloping ledge or shelf directly below her. It might not have been the canyon floor, but it was solid ground she could aim for. She made a snap decision. She would have to jump the rest of the way. Quickly, she shrugged off her backpack and dropped it down ahead of her, hoping it would land first and perhaps soften the impact where she would hit. The pack, containing their remaining water and gear, thumped onto the ledge below. Taking one last deep breath and uttering a desperate prayer, Emily let go of the rock walls. She plunged the remaining distance and hit the ground hard, crumpling on impact. A lightning bolt of pain shot up her legs and through her entire body. Emily gasped and collapsed onto her side. For a moment she was disoriented, eyes watering from pain. She had landed on her feet, and in that instant of impact, she heard and felt a horrifying snap. Her ankle had broken under the force. White-hot agony radiated from her left leg. Emily bit her lip until she tasted blood, determined not to black out. Everything hurt, but she quickly wiggled her fingers and other limbs. Miraculously, aside from the ankle, nothing else seemed permanently damaged. Incredible luck, considering the height of that fall, or perhaps sheer adrenaline shielding her from pain. Gritting her teeth, Emily forced herself up to a crawl, then to a one-legged stand. Alex lay motionless on a small rock ledge about halfway down the overall canyon wall. He had fallen onto this intermediate shelf, which stopped him from plummeting the full 170-plus feet to the canyon floor below. Emily reached his side and immediately saw that his injuries were grievous. He was barely conscious, bleeding, and his limbs lay at unnatural angles. She dropped to her knees beside him, ignoring her own pain. With trembling hands, she checked for a pulse. He had one. faint but present. "Alex, Alex, I'm here," she whispered, tears streaming down her dusty face. He stirred slightly at her voice, eyes half open in a haze of pain. In a barely there whisper, he gasped, You made it. Need to get help." Emily shushed him, brushing his forehead gently. "Don't talk. I'll get us out of this. Just hold on, please." In her heart, Emily already knew the truth. Alex's injuries were too severe. He was bleeding internally. One look at the pallor of his face and the shallow rattle of his breathing told her that time was impossibly short. She cradled his head in her lap, trying to shelter him from shock as best she could. On that ledge, in the middle of nowhere, there was no ambulance coming, no magic button to push for evacuation, only her. And she was injured and completely alone with him. Alex squeezed her hand weakly, perhaps trying to comfort her even now. In a cracked voice, Emily began talking to him, telling him it would be okay, that he wasn't alone, that she loved him. She babbled promises and encouragement, refusing to let him feel fear if she could help it. But within minutes, she felt his grip slacken. A final, shuddering breath escaped Alex's lips, and he fell still. Emily's cries of grief rang out into the empty canyon. She clutched Alex's body and rocked, sobbing. In the span of 24 hours, their joyous adventure had become a tragedy beyond her darkest nightmares. She pressed her forehead to his and closed her eyes, letting out deep, keening wails that no one else was there to hear. The love of her life was gone. They had come here for an escape, and now she was trapped in hell on earth without him. When the first storm of sorrow passed, Emily was left shivering and broken, physically and emotionally. Night was approaching again. Survival mode took over, almost as an act of self-preservation against the crushing grief. She gently laid Alex's head down and forced herself to assess her surroundings and situation. In their desperate climb and fall, escape was now impossible. With her shattered ankle and without climbing gear, she could neither go down further nor climb back up the way she came. She was effectively trapped on this ledge. She dragged herself back to where her backpack had fallen and took inventory of what supplies remained. Mercifully, the pack had survived the drop intact. Inside, she still had their water, about 2 liters left, and a few tuna packets. The survival kit was still there too. By touch and the beam of her flashlight, she pulled out its contents and felt a glimmer of hope at a crucial item, a Mylar emergency blanket. With shaking hands, she unfolded the crinkling reflective blanket. Using some rocks and debris, she rigged up a small makeshift shelter against the canyon wall, creating a little tent of Mylar to help keep her warm through the night and to reflect a signal if any searchlights passed by. She huddled inside this flimsy refuge next to Alex's body, and finally allowed herself to weep in full, muffling her sobs into her arm. The darkness was absolute and offered no comfort, only a merciful cloak over the gruesome scene. When the dawn of April 5th broke over the canyon rim, Emily was utterly exhausted, her body throbbing with pain. For a surreal moment, she half believed the prior day had been just a horrific dream, but the weight of Alex's jacket covering her and the ache in her swollen ankle told the truth. As sunlight crept down the canyon walls, Emily steeled herself with a new resolve. "I'm alive. I have to stay alive." She said these words aloud as a mantra. There would be time to grieve later. If she didn't focus on survival, there might not be a later for her at all. Emily's first priority was water and protection from the sun. Even in early April, Death Valley's daytime heat can be lethal. She had roughly 3 days' worth of water if she rationed strictly. The canyon provided some shade in the morning and late afternoon, but around midday, the sun would blaze directly overhead. She discovered a shallow nook in the rock wall behind some boulders, just big enough for her to crawl into during the hottest part of the day. It wasn't comfortable, but for a few hours each afternoon, that nook mercifully shielded her from the searing sun. With her Mylar blanket, she also devised a way to reflect sunlight away and keep a tiny patch of shade. She established a daily routine. When the sun was at its peak, she would soak a bandana or scrap of cloth with water, drape it over her neck or head, wet her clothes a bit, then lie low in that shaded crevice and wait out the worst heat. Even so, the heat was brutal. Dehydration and sunburn became her new enemies. Her lips cracked and her skin scorched despite her efforts. She sipped water only in small capfuls, stretching each sip out as long as she could stand before relief forced her to swallow. As hours turned into days, Emily faced the deepest tests of her life. The physical pain was excruciating. Her left ankle was swollen and blackening, and any movement sent jolts of agony up her leg. She fashioned a crude splint using 2 sticks from her pack and some bandages, and she wisely kept her boot on the injured foot to control swelling. A decision doctors later said likely saved her foot from complications. Hunger gnawed at her stomach. She rationed the tuna pouches to just a few bites at a time. But the worst pain was emotional. Trapped on that ledge with Alex's body lying nearby, Emily was engulfed by waves of grief and guilt. She talked to him, sometimes out loud and sometimes in her head. She apologized to him over and over for the choice they made to descend. She begged him for the strength to carry on. Every time despair nearly consumed her, some spark of fight flared up inside. No, I will not let this be how our story ends. It was as if Alex's spirit were urging her to live. Unbeknownst to Emily, by April 6th, their families had raised the alarm. When Emily and Alex failed to return as scheduled on April 4th and missed all contact, loved ones knew something was wrong. They alerted the Inyo County Sheriff's Department that the couple was missing in Death Valley. A search and rescue operation was launched on April 7th. Park rangers and volunteers began scouring roads and trails, initially checking popular areas and any place the pair had mentioned wanting to visit. Death Valley covers thousands of square miles, so it was a monumental task to find 2 people, essentially the classic needle in a haystack. What saved Emily's life was the thoughtful clues and actions she and Alex had left behind. Before heading out, Alex had signed in at a backcountry logbook back at the ranger station, noting general planned route and the date they intended to return. This gave researchers a starting point. On April 8th, a breakthrough came. Search teams discovered the white Subaru sitting abandoned on Gold Valley Road, coated in dust and sitting forlorn in the middle of nowhere. The sight of that vehicle must have been eerie for the rescuers. No people in sight, but obvious signs of trouble. Inside, they found the handwritten note Emily and Alex had left. 2 flat tires, headed to Mormon Point, have 3 days' worth of water. This was the critical breadcrumb. Now the searchers knew exactly the direction the couple had gone. Immediately, efforts shifted toward Mormon Point and the canyons in between. Inyo County Search and Rescue, joined by National Park Service rangers, began an air search over the rugged terrain between the car and Mormon Point. Late that morning on April 8th, as Emily sat listlessly on the ledge, she heard a sound that jolted her awake, the distant thumping of helicopter blades. She almost wondered if she imagined it. But no. The hum grew louder. Scrambling as best as she could on one leg, Emily emerged from her shaded nook and looked up. A helicopter appeared as a tiny speck beyond the canyon rim, and the noise echoed between the walls. It was the first man-made sound she had heard in days. Her heart pounded with a mix of joy and desperation. With shaking hands, she grabbed her silver mylar blanket, the best signal device she had, and started waving it frantically. Its reflective surface glinted in the sunlight, a flashing beacon against the brown rock. The helicopter came into view overhead, a rescue chopper performing a grid search. But to Emily's dismay, it kept on flying past her canyon, not noticing the tiny figure pressed against the ledge far below. She didn't panic. Summoning energy from reserves she didn't know she had, Emily waved the blanket even harder, jumping and yelling with every fiber of her being, hoping somehow to catch the crew's eye or at least reflect a flash toward them. A minute later, the sound circled back. They were coming around for a second pass. The helicopter reappeared, this time slower and closer. Emily mustered every ounce of strength to continue signaling. Suddenly, the chopper hesitated and hovered. They had spotted something, the brilliant glimmer of the mylar, or a hint of color. She waved both arms now, nearly delirious with hope. The pilot rocked the chopper in what looked like an acknowledgement. Then, to her surprise, it flew away out of sight. Emily's heart dropped into her stomach. Why were they leaving? Did they lose sight of her? She realized quickly that the canyon's shape and winds might make an immediate rescue attempt impossible. Perhaps they needed to refuel or bring in specialized personnel. They saw me. They're going to come back. They have to, she told herself repeatedly, fighting back the terror that she'd been left behind. As daylight waned on April 8th, Emily remained alert, expecting rescue at any moment. It wasn't until around 7:30 p.m., as dusk settled, that she heard another buzzing sound, higher pitched than the helicopter. Peering upward, she saw a small drone hovering above her, a beam of light shining down. The rescue team had deployed a drone to pinpoint her exact location on the ledge. She shouted and waved at the drone, though of course the operators could likely see her clearly already. Knowing she was found but not yet saved was a strange emotional whiplash. She was no longer invisible, yet she had to survive one more night out here. When the drone finally retreated, darkness had fallen completely. Emily settled in for what she prayed would be the last night on the ledge. It was a cold and fitful night, but inside, she clung to hope like a lifeline. At first light on April 9th, Emily was exhausted, dehydrated, and weak, but alive and alert. With sunrise came the now familiar thump of a returning helicopter, only this time it was accompanied by a second chopper. The cavalry had arrived in full force. The team in charge now was a specialized Navy search and rescue unit flown in for a technical extraction. Relief and anticipation surged through Emily. She watched as the Navy helicopter approached the canyon carefully. Over the noise, she could make out figures being lowered on a hoist, 2 rescuers dangling in midair, descending toward her. The operation was perilous. The slot canyon's tight walls created swirling winds, and there was little room to maneuver a helicopter safely. From her perspective, it looked like a terrifying dance with the cliffs. The rotor wash kicked up dust and threatened to slam the rescuers into the rock. Emily braced herself as debris whipped around. For 20 tense minutes, she watched these brave men and women battle the elements to reach her. The helicopter would inch closer, only to be buffeted by wind, forcing a retreat in a second try. Finally, 2 Navy rescuers reached the ledge. They approached Emily carefully and strapped her into a rescue basket. Emily's eyes flooded with tears. They also carefully tended to Alex. Even though he was beyond saving, the team treated his remains with solemn respect. In just a few moments, she would be clear of this nightmare below, but it meant leaving Alex behind on that rock, at least for a little while. The canyon that had imprisoned her now lay spread out beneath her dangling feet, a jagged maw in the vast expanse of Death Valley. In the morning light, the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, silent and golden. It took her breath away that in all that emptiness, the rescuers had managed to find a single human being clinging to a rock ledge. The fact that she was being pulled from this remote hell felt nothing short of a miracle, and she shook with sobs as the helicopter carried her away from the canyon that had nearly been her tomb. Alex's body was recovered by a second team shortly after. In a matter of hours, Emily went from stranded and utterly alone to being surrounded by caring hands in a flying metal cocoon. It was almost disorienting. They flew her to a hospital in Bishop, California, where doctors immediately set to treating her injuries. Her left ankle was badly broken, requiring emergency surgery to repair. She was severely dehydrated and sunburned, and the doctors marveled at her condition. It could have been much worse. They later told her that her decision to keep her boot on and use makeshift first aid likely prevented more severe damage or infection. Emily spent 6 days in the hospital recovering physically, but the emotional healing would take far longer. Survivor's guilt weighed heavily on her. Why had she survived while Alex had not? Could she have done anything differently to change the outcome? Counselors and her loved ones reassured her that she had done everything she could. In fact, her quick thinking and refusal to give up had given rescuers the crucial clues needed to find them at all. Back home in Cincinnati, Ohio, Emily leaned on family and friends to start the slow process of healing. The story of what happened in Death Valley made headlines across the country. People were stunned by the tale of a couple's tragic camping trip and the woman who survived days in the desert against all odds. Many hailed Emily's survival as a testament to human endurance and the power of hope. In the aftermath, those close to Alex ensured that his legacy would live on. He had been passionate about public service and the outdoors. In fact, before his death, he was working on legislation to help veterans enjoy national parks. Later that year, Congress honored him by renaming the bill the Alexander Lofgren Veterans in Parks Act, granting free lifetime national park access to veterans and Gold Star families. It was signed into law in December 2021. This act stands as a lasting tribute to Alex, a man who believed deeply in the healing power of nature and who ultimately gave his life in one of nature's most beautiful yet unforgiving places. Emily Henkel's story is one of unimaginable heartbreak and incredible resilience. She entered Death Valley on a carefree adventure with the man she loved and left it scarred, but alive, carrying a story few could fathom. Emily honors Alex's spirit. Their tragic journey has touched countless people, reminding us of the thin line between joy and sorrow, and the strength that lies within the human spirit when pushed to the brink. And that wraps up the true survival story of Emily and Alex. What an absolutely heart-wrenching journey, from the thrill of adventure to the depths of despair, and ultimately to one woman's inspiring survival. It's a powerful reminder of how quickly nature can humble us and how courage and love can carry someone through the darkest of times. If this story moved you, please give this video a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel for more immersive true stories of resilience and hope. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below about Emily's incredible strength or any lessons you take from their journey. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. 72 days stranded on a frozen mountainside, starving, snowblind, and forced to break the ultimate taboo to survive. It sounds impossible, but this isn't fiction. This is the true survival story of an Andes plane crash so astounding that it's forever known as the Miracle in the Andes. A routine flight turned into a nightmare entrapment on an icy glacier, where a group of young men defied death in ways the world could scarcely imagine. They were ordinary athletes and friends, not adventurers braced for catastrophe. How did a fun trip to a rugby match descend into 72 days of frozen hell? And what unimaginable choices enabled these survivors to cling to life against all odds? To understand the miracle that unfolded high in the Andes, we must start at the very beginning, with a crash that no one was ever supposed to survive. It all began on October 12, 1972. A Uruguayan amateur rugby team, the Old Christians Club, chartered a Fairchild FH-227D aircraft to fly from Montevideo, Uruguay to Santiago, Chile for a friendly match. On board were 45 people, teammates, friends, family members, and crew, all in high spirits. As they took off on Friday the 13th, the young rugby players cracked jokes about the unlucky date, never dreaming how prophetic that jest would become. The crash. High over the rugged Andes, bad weather forced the pilots to divert south and then turn back north toward Chile. Believing they had cleared the highest peaks, the crew began to descend, but they were terribly mistaken. At 3:30 p.m. on October 13th, the unthinkable happened. The plane grazed a mountainside, shearing off one wing, then the other, before careening down a remote valley enveloped in snow. Inside the cabin, seats ripped from the floor and hurtled forward as the fuselage hurtled down the slope. When the mangled metal finally skidded to a halt, silence and shock fell over the survivors. Of the 45 people on board, 12 were killed instantly in the crash. The cockpit was crushed like tin foil. The pilots did not survive. In the torn cabin, those left alive slowly realized their predicament. 33 survivors crawled from the wreckage onto a barren glacier at 11,500 feet elevation, a world of ice and rock with thin air and night temperatures plummeting to 30 degrees below zero. Dazed and injured, they huddled in the shattered fuselage for any scrap of shelter. Some made makeshift walls from suitcases and debris to block the bitter wind. As daylight faded on that first horrific day, the group of mostly teenage and 20-something boys did the only thing they could. They clung to one another for warmth, praying that rescue would come by morning. But morning brought no rescue. Over the next days, the survivors tended to their wounded and took stock of their scant supplies. Among them was 22-year-old Fernando "Nando" Parado, who had been knocked unconscious in the crash and lay in a coma for 3 days. When Nando finally awoke, he was surrounded by the clear, beautiful faces of friends, relieved he was alive. But he soon learned his mother had died in the crash, and his 19-year-old sister Susie was gravely injured, unable to move. Nando spent that first night by her side, melting snow in his mouth to drip water into her lips. All around, others suffered broken bones and deep cuts. Nando's close friend Roberto Canessa, a medical student, assumed a lead role in caring for the injured, improvising splints and encouraging those in shock. Each passing hour was a balancing act between hope and despair. By day 8 of their ordeal, young Susie, Nando's beloved sister, succumbed to her injuries and died in his arms. One by one, others also slipped away in those early days from wounds that were just too severe. The survivors' count fell further, and with it, their hearts. Still, those remaining refused to surrender to grief just yet. They focused on survival, doing whatever they could to stay alive until rescuers arrived. On the frozen mountainside, there was no vegetation and no animals to hunt, just endless snow. The group's entire food supply amounted to a few chocolate bars, some crackers and jam, a bit of dried fruit, and a couple of bottles of wine. Even with strict rationing, 1 nibble of chocolate per person, sips of wine, and melted snow for water, within a week, these meager provisions were completely gone. Desperation grew. Some boys tried stuffing their stomachs with pieces of shredded airplane seat foam or strips of leather from luggage to no avail. Their bodies were consuming themselves. Starvation had become a very real and lethal threat. As hunger gnawed and their bellies ached hollowly, an unspeakable idea crept into their conversations. Nando, gaunt and weak, took 3 days just to eat a single chocolate-covered peanut. He knew this couldn't continue. Late one evening, roughly a week after the crash, Nando turned to a friend and spoke the words no one wanted to say aloud. They could eat the flesh of those who had died. Human meat. It was an unthinkable taboo solution, but it might be the only way to avoid slow, certain death. When this proposal was brought to the group, it sparked an agonizing debate that lasted all through the day. These were devout young men, many raised Catholic. The idea of cannibalism horrified them. A few flatly refused at first, but others pointed out a grim truth. Their friends who had perished no longer needed their bodies, but the living did. Several of those who died had been among the strongest and healthiest. Their stored fat and muscle could literally fuel the others' survival. Some survivors tearfully pledged their own bodies to the group if they themselves should die, viewing it as an offering of life rather than a desecration. In a way, it was like the ultimate sacrifice of friendship. One survivor later said, "We donated our bodies. You could die, and you could help the others to live." Finally, as hunger and hopelessness mounted, most of the group made a pact. They would do the unthinkable to survive, and the souls of their lost friends would surely understand. They waited for the right moment, hearts pounding with dread and resolve. Then came another crushing blow. On the 11th day, through a static crackling transistor radio that survivor Roy Harley had coaxed into working, they heard the news they feared most. The official search for them had been called off. The outside world had given them up for dead. Sobs of despair echoed in the fuselage as this news sank in. If rescue wasn't coming, survival was now entirely up to them. That same day, with grim determination, the survivors set aside the last shreds of taboo. A small team used broken glass from the wreck to carefully cut strips of flesh from the bodies of their fallen friends, which had been preserved in the snow outside. Trembling hands brought the first slivers of frozen flesh to their lips. They prayed for forgiveness, some recalling the scripture, "This is my body, which is given for you." In their minds, it was an act of necessity and even of love, a final gift from the deceased that would keep their companions alive. One reluctant young man closed his eyes and told himself he was taking communion. In that moment, the taboo was broken. They would live at least a little longer by consuming the only nourishment the mountain provided, the bodies of their own friends. Life on the glacier. Sustained by this macabre diet, the remaining survivors persisted through the end of October. They endured indescribable routine hardships, nights of bone-cracking cold where they woke with frost in their hair, days of blinding sun off the snow that burned their skin and snow blistered their lips. To stave off hypothermia, they punched each other's arms to keep blood flowing and huddled so closely that they could feel the rise and fall of each other's chests. All the while, they kept the faith that somehow, someday, they would be found, or perhaps they could find a way out themselves. By late October, over 2 weeks in, 27 people remained alive. Some of the strongest, Nando, Roberto, and a few others nicknamed the Expeditionaries, began scouting possible escape routes during brief breaks in the weather. They knew their location was so remote that hiking out might be the only way to alert the world. But every attempt to climb the steep surrounding peaks was thwarted by altitude sickness and knee-deep powder. They improvised snowshoes from airplane insulation and cushions strapped to their feet, only to turn back each time, exhausted and snowblind. Each failure drove home the despair of their isolation. They were utterly alone in a vast white wilderness. Still, Nando kept one thought burning in his mind. His father was waiting for him, thinking him dead, and Nando refused to let his father lose his entire family. Then, on October 29th, just as the group was clinging to a fragile routine, tragedy struck again. In the dead of night, a low rumble rose in the distance, growing into a thunder. Before anyone could react, a massive avalanche roared down the mountain and engulfed the fuselage. Snow blasted through every gap, instantly burying the sleeping survivors under a suffocating blanket. Those who weren't crushed struggled in darkness, entombed by snow packed tight as cement. Nando was pinned, unable to move, barely able to breathe. Around him, muffled cries and panicked shouts filled the pitch-black cabin. By sheer luck, one alert survivor, Roy Harley, had leapt to his feet when he heard the avalanche coming and thus wasn't completely buried. Roy clawed his way toward faint voices, digging air holes to free a few companions, who in turn dug out others. In the frantic minutes and hours that followed, they managed to pull several people from the snow, saving many who would have suffocated. Even so, of the 27 people who had huddled in the fuselage, 8 were dead by the time the avalanche settled. The survivors were now reduced to 19, and in a cruel twist, they were trapped even worse than before. The fuselage was completely buried in snow, only a tiny air pocket remained inside. They hacked a small hole through the roof with a metal pole to get oxygen, but for 3 long days the blizzard raged on outside, forcing them to wait in darkness next to the bodies of their friends who had just perished. Hell would have been a comfortable place compared to those days under the avalanche, one survivor quipped grimly later. Finally, when the storm abated, the survivors dug their way out of the snowy tomb, crawling back onto the surface of the glacier into blinding daylight. They were alive, but battered psychologically and physically. If there had been any remaining hope that staying put and waiting might lead to rescue, it was now gone. They realized with dread certainty that the only way off this mountain would be on their own 2 feet. In the following weeks, the 16 men still alive, 3 more had died from their injuries and the punishing conditions in the avalanche's aftermath, devoted themselves to a single goal: escape. They waited for late spring weather to improve and used every ounce of ingenuity to prepare for a desperate trek. The clothing they had was utterly inadequate, so they layered whatever they could scavenge, multiple sweaters, jeans, and socks wrapped in plastic to ward off the brutal cold. They crafted snowshoes and a crude sleeping bag by stitching insulation and spare cloth from the plane seats. Nando noticed his belt had no notches left. He had lost so much weight that he'd punched new holes all the way to the end. A stark signal that time was running out. They had to leave before their bodies failed. This would be their final gamble, a do-or-die march out of the Andes to find help. On the morning of December 12, 1972, day 61 of their ordeal, the expedition finally began. Nando Parado, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Tintin Vicentin volunteered to venture forth, carrying the hopes of all 16 survivors on their backs. Their plan was simple but daunting: climb over the nearest mountain peak, believing Chile lay just beyond, then hike down to civilization. Before setting off, the 3 young men shared a solemn moment with the others. Nando turned to his remaining friends in the fuselage and promised, "I will come back. I'm going to bring help." He also made a heartbreaking offer. If food ran out, those left behind could consume his share of their friends, including Nando's own mother and sister, whose bodies still remained in the snow. It was his way of saying he'd sacrifice anything to ensure the group's survival. With tears, embraces, and a last look at their makeshift camp on the glacier, the 3 trudged off into the unknown, disappearing up the steep incline. Climbing at over 3,500 meters altitude, 12,000 plus feet, with improvised gear, would test them to the limit. The thin air made each step a labor. Experts would later note that one should only gain a few hundred meters of elevation per day at such heights, but these determined friends climbed twice that in a single morning. Under a merciless sun, they scrambled upward, lungs burning, legs trembling. By afternoon, altitude sickness hit hard. Nando's heart raced uncontrollably, and Roberto became dizzy and nauseated. The trio had planned to reach the summit by sundown on day 1, but that goal proved wildly optimistic. It actually took 3 grueling days to scale the peak that loomed above their crash site. Every night, they huddled together in their precious sleeping bag under the open sky, temperatures plunging well below zero. On the first night, the cold was so extreme that their plastic water bottle shattered from the freezing temperatures. Still, they pressed on, driven by the image of green valleys presumably just beyond the summit. On the 3rd day of climbing, Nando finally staggered to the top of the mountain ahead of the others. He stood at 4,650 meters, 15,000 feet, expecting to gaze down at the lush foothills of Chile and the end of their nightmare. Instead, as he looked out, his heart dropped. In every direction lay only endless jagged mountains, peak after snowy peak. The crash site was far deeper in the Andes than they realized. Chile was not just one ridge away, it was many mountains away. "We thought we were maybe 5 kilometers from help," Nando later said, "but it was more like 80. For a moment, atop that summit, their last hope seemed to evaporate. Exhausted and starving after days of climbing, how could they possibly cross dozens more miles of forbidding wilderness? Nando slumped down to wait for Roberto and Tintin to reach the top. In that pivotal moment, he faced a choice: give up and turn back, essentially a death sentence for all of them, or push forward into the unknown. When Roberto Canessa crawled up to the summit and saw the same disheartening panorama, he nearly broke down. But Nando refused to let despair win. He looked at Roberto and spoke firmly: "If we go back, we die. We've come this far. We must keep going." Nando's resolve ignited Roberto's. They decided on the spot that Tintin, who was weaker and consuming precious food, should return to the fuselage with the news that the journey would be longer than expected. They gave him a share of their remaining meat and even fashioned a sled so he could slide downhill, back to the others. Tintin would make it back in just 1 hour. Nando and Roberto, now alone, forged ahead westward with nothing but snow-capped peaks on the horizon, fully aware that it was a near-suicidal gamble. "This is a kamikaze expedition," Nando had said, acknowledging that they might not return, but it was a risk they had to take. For 10 harrowing days, Parado and Canessa trekked through the Andes. Each day they awoke on frigid bare ground, their bodies skeletal and weary, and willed themselves to continue. As they descended from the highest altitudes, the landscape gradually began to change. The eternal white of the glacier gave way to patches of brown earth. Then came a miraculous sight: green grass and even a few grazing cows on distant slopes. These signs of civilization spurred them on. They followed a river downstream, reasoning that it would lead to people. Sure enough, on December 20th, as the two staggered along a riverbank, they spotted humans on the far side of a roaring river. 3 Chilean herdsmen on horseback. Nando and Roberto were so weak they could barely shout over the torrent. They jumped and waved, trying to convey their desperation. The astonished muleteers across the river could see these wild-looking strangers calling to them, but the rush of water drowned out the words. Finally, one of the men found a pencil and paper, wrapped them around a rock, and threw it across the river. Roberto scribbled a brief message and hurled it back. "I come from a plane that fell in the mountains." That now famous note was the first confirmation the outside world would have of the survivor's existence. Reading it, the herdsman Sergio Catalan realized with a shock who these men must be: the long-lost rugby players from the news. With darkness falling, Catalan shouted that he would ride to get help and return in the morning. Before leaving, the kind Chileans tossed pieces of bread across the river to the emaciated men. Fernando and Roberto, after 10 days of walking and 72 days of starvation, those crusts of bread tasted like heaven. True to his word, the next day, December 21st, Sergio Catalan returned, now accompanied by police and mountain rescue officials. The ordeal was almost over. The 2 survivors guided the authorities toward the crash site's location as best they could describe. On December 22, 1972, rescue helicopters finally located the remaining survivors on the mountain. Down on the glacier, the 14 men who had stayed behind had nearly given up hope of ever seeing Nando and Roberto again. Then, around midday, a thunderous noise signaled the approach of helicopters. One of the boys ran out of the broken fuselage, waving a bright yellow sleeping bag. The pilots spotted movement on that snowfield, and to the survivors' astonishment, a helicopter began to descend. After 72 days, help had arrived. When the first helicopter touched down on the makeshift helipad stomped in the snow, Nando was on board, leading the rescue team. As he jumped out, 3 of his closest friends, barefoot and skeletal but alive, rushed from the wreckage and pounced on him in joy, smothering him in hugs and grateful kisses. It was a scene of overwhelming emotion, the kind of euphoria few on Earth have ever experienced. After 10 weeks on the brink of death, they were saved. Due to weight limits in the extreme altitude, only half of the survivors could be airlifted out at a time. Nando insisted on staying until the last trip. The first group of 6 was flown to a hospital in San Fernando, Chile, and the remaining 8 spent one final night on the mountain, now accompanied by rescuers who fed and warmed them, before they too were lifted to safety on December 23rd. Against all odds, 16 of the 45 people on that flight had survived. They had endured 72 days on a glacier through sheer willpower, teamwork, and a little bit of miracle. The snowbound boys of the Andes were going home. The ordeal of Flight 571 was over, but the story was far from finished. As the survivors recovered in hospitals, the world learned of their astounding tale and latched on to one shocking detail above all: they had survived by eating the flesh of their dead. When this truth emerged, sensational headlines splashed across newspapers worldwide. Some reporters crudely dubbed them cannibals without grasping the context. There was public curiosity and even outrage from those who didn't understand the desperation of life and death. But the young men, in interviews, calmly explained the impossible position they'd been in. One survivor plainly stated, "The only food were the bodies of those who died, so we ate them." They emphasized how they had all agreed it was an act of survival and that their friends-turned-food had essentially given their lives twice, once in dying and again in sustaining the living. In a deeply Catholic country like Uruguay, this could have sparked moral scandal. Yet the Catholic Church stood by the survivors, officially declaring that, given the extremity of the circumstances, no sin had been committed by consuming human flesh. A priest likened it to the biblical Last Supper. Just as Jesus offered his body to save others, these boys had been saved by the bodies of their friends. This perspective helped many understand the terrible necessity behind the taboo. Families of the deceased also offered their forgiveness and love, recognizing that their lost sons and daughters would have wanted the team to live. Over time, the initial shock gave way to awe at the sheer resilience and unity the group had shown. The 16 survivors themselves were suddenly thrust into fame. They returned to a hero's welcome in Uruguay, and for months they were swarmed by journalists and well-wishers. Emaciated almost beyond recognition, Nando had lost 45 kilograms, approximately 100 pounds, and looked like skin and bones. They slowly regained their strength. Many had frostbite, malnutrition, and lingering injuries to recover from, but all of them survived the rehabilitation. Psychologically, some feared they'd be haunted by nightmares or guilt. But remarkably, most of them, like Nando, later reported that they did not suffer lasting trauma or remorse for what they had done to survive. They had looked death in the face and made peace with it on that mountain. What remained was a profound gratitude for life. As Nando put it years later, "Every time I breathe, it's like a miracle. I shouldn't be here." In the years that followed, the survivors formed a lifelong bond. More than teammates or friends, truly brothers who shared a second birth. They even created a foundation that encouraged organ donation, inspired by their experience of giving life to one another. Each year on December 22nd, the group gathers with their families to celebrate what they call their second birthday, honoring the day they were rescued and remembering those who did not return. A simple iron cross stands in the Andes at the site of the crash, a memorial to the 29 souls who perished there. The survivors have all visited it, laying to rest the memories of their friends in that place where life, death, sacrifice, and hope became eternally intertwined. In the end, the miracle in the Andes is far more than a tale of cannibalism or tragedy. It's a story of the indomitable human spirit. 16 young men survived the unsurvivable by banding together in courage, faith, and unwavering determination. They emerged from that glacier not as victims, but as living proof that even in the most desperate circumstances, humanity can find a way to endure. Their story asks us to consider the unthinkable decisions one might make when pushed to the absolute brink, and it shows that sometimes hope can ignite from the darkest places. Even now, decades later, the survivors will tell you they are not heroes or superhuman. They were ordinary people who simply refused to let go of life. As Nando Parado reflects, he doesn't live in the shadow of those 72 days, but he carries their lessons always, that every additional day alive is a gift, and that the bonds of friendship and family can give you strength you never knew you had. The miracle in the Andes stands as an emotionally powerful reminder of how precious life is. It's a true survival story that continues to inspire and humble all who hear it. Thank you for watching. If this incredible journey moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more true stories of human resilience. Together, let's honor these survivors' legacy by treasuring the value of life and the power of hope. Until next time, stay inspired and take care of one another.